The cowboy had only meant to pass through. After 5 straight days riding dusty trails and sleeping under nothing but the open sky, all he wanted from the small frontier town was a warm meal, a drink, and a quiet night. But before he could even tie his horse outside the saloon, he sensed something was wrong. The usual bustle of the main street had gathered itself into a tight knot around the old freight platform, a platform normally used for barrels, crates, or travelers' luggage. Not people. A rough voice shouted over the murmuring crowd. The cowboy stepped closer, boots crunching over gravel, his brow tightening as he took in the scene. A group of hired guns, the kind who wore smiles like knives, stood guard around the platform. And on top of it stood a young Apache woman, bound at the wrists, standing so still and proud it made his chest clench. She couldn't have been more than 23 or 24. Dust streaked her cheeks, her long black hair hung heavy, and her buckskin clothing was torn at one sleeve. Yet even in her exhaustion, there was a steadiness in her posture, shoulders back, chin lifting just enough to show she refused to bow to anyone here. The auctioneer barked, captured 2 nights ago. Strong. Silent. Doesn't cause trouble. He paced like he was advertising a mule. The woman's eyes narrowed, just slightly, a flicker of fire breaking through her calm. She didn't look afraid. She looked insulted. The crowd murmured but kept their distance. No one wanted to be the first. Some were afraid of Apache retaliation. Some pretended not to care. But the cowboy saw something different, shame, unease, and a strange kind of pity that still didn't lead a single person to act. He felt heat rise in his chest, the wrongness of it all. The false bravado of the outlaws. The cowardice of the spectators. The quiet humiliation forced upon the woman who never once asked for mercy. She didn't break eye contact with the world around her. Not even when the auctioneer tried to turn her face to the crowd. She jerked back, jaw tightening, as though she'd rather be struck than handled like property. The cowboy told himself to walk away. This wasn't his fight. He wasn't a lawman, and he sure didn't have the coin to throw around for trouble that wasn't his. He had work waiting on his ranch and a life that didn't involve stepping into danger for strangers. But then, she looked at him. Only for a second. A brief lift of her eyes, dark and tired but burning with pride. She seemed to be measuring him, seeing whether he was like the others or whether there was still someone in this dusty world with a shred of decency. Something shifted in him, a pull he couldn't explain, a warmth blooming deep behind his ribs. The auctioneer sighed loudly, annoyed. "All right, folks. Half off. Someone take her before I drag her to the next town." The cowboy's hand twitched at his side. His heart hammered. He didn't understand the feeling fully, but he knew one truth with absolute clarity: if he walked away now, he'd never forgive himself. The auctioneer's voice cracked through the dusty air again, sharper this time, an ugly laugh riding behind it. "Half off. She's strong, healthy. Someone make a bid before I start losing money." People shifted uncomfortably. Boots scuffed, hats lowered, eyes turned away as if refusing to look would make the scene disappear. No one wanted the responsibility. No one wanted the risk. No one wanted her, not because she lacked worth, but because fear wrapped around the town like a tightening rope. The cowboy felt his jaw tighten. The Apache woman stood unmoving, but this time he noticed it, the smallest tremor in her fingers, a sign she was nearing the end of her strength. Not weakness, just exhaustion, the kind that comes after days of being watched like prey. She didn't look at him again, but something about her stillness seemed directed at him. Or maybe it was just his own conscience, heavier with each breath. The auctioneer clapped his hands. "Last call. Nobody. Not even for scrap labor." A few men chuckled. The sound made the cowboy's stomach twist. He didn't know why this mattered so much. He had ridden past injustice before, in a world where right and wrong were sometimes blurred by dust and survival. But this felt different. The woman's pride, her silence, her refusal to be anything less than whole, it hit him with an uncomfortable clarity. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She didn't even glare. She simply stood, as if daring the world to decide what kind of men they were. The cowboy's heartbeat thudded in his ears. His hand lifted instinctively toward the brim of his hat, brushing sweat from his brow, but the motion shifted, his fingers rising higher. Before he knew it, his arm was up. A bid. The crowd gasped softly. Heads turned. People stared at him as though he'd volunteered to wrestle a rattlesnake. The auctioneer blinked, surprised but relieved. Well, now we're talkin'. One bid. That's something. The cowboy swallowed. His voice felt thick when he finally spoke, but it came out steady enough. That's my offer. The woman's head turned then, slow, almost reluctant. Her eyes found him. Not hopeful. Not grateful. Just searching, trying to read him the same way she might track a deer trail or a distant smoke column. Her gaze held his for several long breaths. She seemed to be asking him silently, are you like them? Or different? He held her gaze without flinching. He didn't smile. Didn't puff his chest. Didn't try to seem kind or heroic. He simply let her see the truth, that he didn't understand everything, but he intended no harm. She blinked, just once. A quiet acknowledgement. The auctioneer took the cowboy's payment quickly, eager to avoid any arguments. The transaction felt wrong to the cowboy, the way the coins clinked, the way the outlaws loosened her bindings as if she were merchandise, not a living human. The bitterness of it burned in his chest. The moment he stepped forward to stand beside her, the air felt different. Charged. Heavy with uncertainty. The woman didn't move away from him, not a single inch. She stood tall, chin still high, but her eyes remained locked on his with a mix of suspicion and something softer, something he couldn't yet name. He didn't touch her. Didn't guide her. He simply murmured, you walk free now. Her breath shook, barely noticeable, but there. A tiny break in her composed armor. And for the first time since he saw her, the cowboy realized, saving her was only the beginning. The moment the outlaws loosened her bindings, the Apache woman stepped back, not out of fear, but out of instinct, reclaiming her personal space like someone used to standing alone against the world. The cowboy didn't move closer. He simply waited, hands open at his sides, letting her choose the distance. For a second, she glanced at her freed wrists, rubbing the raw marks left behind. The sight sent a quiet ache through him, but he forced himself not to stare. She was proud, self-contained. He didn't want pity to be the first thing she saw in him. He cleared his throat softly. I have a horse outside town. If you'll come with me, I'll take you somewhere safe. If not, you're free to go your own way. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked a slow circle, testing the stretch of her arms, feeling the air without restraint. Her breathing steadied. Her spine straightened. A spark of her true self flickered through her tired features. Only then did she give a small nod. Relief washed over him, gentle, warm, almost startling in its force. They walked through town together, though several feet apart. People stared, whispers trailing behind them, but neither reacted. Dust swirled around their boots as the late afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the main street. When they reached his horse, a calm, chestnut mare, he offered a waterskin first. You're thirsty, he murmured. She hesitated only a moment before taking it. Their fingers brushed, light as breath, fleeting but powerful enough to send a quiet jolt up his arm. She drank slowly, carefully, never taking her eyes off him entirely. He couldn't tell whether she was suspicious or simply studying him, trying to understand his intentions without words. Thank you, she said finally, her voice gentle but hoarse. It was the first word she'd spoken directly to him, and it sank into him deeper than he expected. He handed her his spare blanket from the saddlebag. Nights get cold on the trail. She accepted it with a low nod, clutching the fabric with both hands as if testing whether it was truly hers to hold. They mounted the horse, him at the front, her behind him, though he left enough room that she didn't feel pressed. The mare stepped into a steady trot, hooves thudding softly against hard-packed earth. For the first hour, she stayed quiet, the wind fluttering her hair across his shoulder. Every now and then, the corner of the blanket brushed his back, a soft reminder she was there, real, alive, and trying to trust him. The desert stretched around them, orange cliffs, dry sage, the endless horizon. The world felt bigger without the crowd, without the cruelty of the auctioneer's voice echoing across wooden boards. Out here, there was only the wind, and the half-formed connection growing between them like a seed finally finding water. When the sun dipped low, painting the sky in warm rose and amber, he finally spoke. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly. "I didn't take you out of there so you'd follow me." She leaned forward ever so slightly, not touching him, but close enough for her warmth to reach his back. "I know," she whispered. Two simple words, but her tone carried something deeper, awareness, caution, and the faintest trace of trust. They rode on into the dusk, strangers becoming something more, step by slow step. By the time they reached his small ranch, the sky had darkened to deep violet, and the desert wind had sharpened into something cold enough to sting the skin. The cowboy lit a lantern and pushed the cabin door open, stepping aside so she could walk in first. He didn't announce this choice or make a show of it, it simply felt like the right thing to do. The cabin was modest but warm, a sturdy bed, a stone fireplace, shelves lined with jars of dried herbs and old tools. She paused just inside the doorway, scanning the room slowly, taking in every corner with the instinct of someone who had learned not to trust easily. "I'll take the floor tonight," he said, nodding toward the fireplace. "You can have the bed. It's clean. Warm." She turned her head toward him, her eyes narrowing slightly in surprise. No one in the last days, possibly weeks, had offered her anything without expecting something in return. She stepped toward the hearth, holding the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The firelight threw soft gold across her features, illuminating the exhaustion she had tried so hard to hide. Her composure cracked just slightly, revealing how much she must have endured. He busied himself boiling water, giving her space. He felt her gaze occasionally flick toward him, curious, cautious, measuring. Not frightened, just watchful. When he handed her a steaming cup of herbal tea, their fingers grazed again, this time slower, more aware. She accepted it with both hands, lifting it to her lips with a small sigh of relief as the warmth seeped through her palms. Minutes passed in silence, comfortable, but heavy with unspoken questions. Finally, she set the cup down and spoke, her voice soft and steady, "Why did you buy me?" The question struck him harder than he expected, hanging in the air like smoke. He opened his mouth once, then closed it, searching for words that didn't feel clumsy or arrogant. "I didn't buy you," he said at last. "I bought the right to walk you out of that town alive. That's all." She studied him, head tilted slightly, as if weighing the sincerity of each word. Her eyes reflected the fire's glow, deep and unreadable. "And what do you want for that?" she asked. He shook his head. "Nothing. You don't owe me a thing. You're safe here until you decide your next step." Her expression softened, barely, but enough that he noticed the shift. Her shoulders relaxed, the tension in her jaw eased. She touched the side of her cup, absorbing its warmth before looking back at him. "There are not many men like that," she said quietly. He rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm not sure I'm much of anything. Just couldn't stand the way they were looking at you. Like you weren't a person." Her eyes flickered, a sign that his words had landed somewhere deep. She stood then, stepping closer to the fire, and unintentionally closer to him. The space between them shrank to a few feet, filled with warmth and something fragile, new. "Thank you," she whispered. The word trembled slightly, as if unused to being spoken. The cowboy felt the breath catch in his chest. Not because of the words themselves, but because of the way she looked at him, directly, honestly, without anger or guardedness. It was the first real crack in her walls. And he understood, in that moment, that trust from her would come slowly, but it would be worth every step. Morning light crept across the cabin floorboards long before either of them spoke. The cowboy had woken early, stiff from sleeping near the fireplace, but he didn't mind. When he glanced toward the bed, he found her still asleep, wrapped gently in the blanket he'd given her. For the first time since he'd seen her standing on that wooden platform, her face looked peaceful. Unburdened. Young. He stepped outside to give her privacy when she woke. By the time she joined him, the sun was climbing and a soft blush warmed her cheeks from the cold. She held herself with quiet dignity, but there was less stiffness now. She had braided her hair neatly, tied with a strip of cloth she must have found in one of the drawers. It was a small thing, but it made his chest warm. She was reclaiming pieces of her life, her identity. "I can help," she said simply, scanning the ranch yard. He hesitated. "You don't have to work." Her eyes lifted to his, steady and clear. "I know. But I want to." So he showed her, slowly, gently, how to mend the fence line. He demonstrated how to hold the worn wooden planks in place, and she watched every movement with sharp attention. When their hands brushed passing the nails, she didn't pull away. She just looked up at him, a question flickering in her eyes. Not suspicion anymore. Something closer to curiosity, and trust. It warmed him more deeply than the sun. They worked side by side through the morning, sharing the kind of quiet that felt natural, unforced. When she laughed softly at one point, a tiny, surprised sound that escaped when she saw his horse stubbornly refuse a bucket of water, he nearly forgot how to breathe. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh, and it felt like a reward he didn't deserve but treasured anyway. Around midday, she surprised him. "You ride like a man who respects the land," she said, examining the trail near the stable. He blinked. "Is that good or bad?" "Good," she said, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Very good." Later, he offered to teach her how to ride his gentlest horse, Ember. She hesitated only a heartbeat before placing her hand on the mare's neck. Her fingers were light, reverent, almost familiar, as if she'd known horses all her life. He stood close, not touching, but ready in case she needed support. She mounted gracefully, and when she swayed slightly, his hand lifted instinctively to steady her. His palm brushed the small of her back, warm contact that sent a subtle shiver through both of them. She didn't pull away. Instead, she steadied herself, inhaled deeply, and whispered, "I trust this horse, and maybe a little bit, I trust you." The words hit him like a slow, spreading heat behind his ribs. As the evening chill settled over the ranch, she rubbed her arms lightly. Without thinking, he shrugged off his coat and placed it over her shoulders. She froze, not out of fear, but touched by the gesture. Her fingers held the fabric close, and she looked up into his eyes with a softness that hadn't been there before. "You are kind," she murmured, almost shy. He shook his head. "Just trying to make sure you're warm." Her gaze lingered on him longer than necessary. And in that quiet moment, beneath the fading golden light, something shifted between them, subtle, tentative, but undeniably real. The storm rolled in without warning, thick clouds swallowing the sky, wind whipping sand across the ranch yard in wild spirals. The cowboy barely managed to secure the barn doors before the first thunder cracked overhead, shaking the earth beneath their feet. Inside the cabin, the lantern flickered against the walls, casting warm, shifting shadows. She stood near the window, watching the sky break open with a kind of quiet awe. Lightning flashed, illuminating the worry on her face, memories she tried to hide, dangers she once survived. He noticed. "You're safe in here," he said softly, setting another log on the fire. She didn't turn at first. But when she did, her expression held layers he hadn't seen before, fear sharpened by honesty, courage softened by vulnerability. "Storms never frightened me before," she murmured. "It's what comes after them, that I learned to fear." He swallowed, unsure how to respond. So he simply nodded toward the hearth, inviting her to sit. She did, slowly, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. The fire crackled, warm and rhythmic, a soft contrast to the chaos outside. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, she broke the silence. "I was not afraid on that stage," she said quietly, eyes fixed on the flames. "Not of them. Not of what they wanted." Her voice trembled, not with weakness, but with the weight of the truth she'd kept buried. He leaned slightly forward, elbows resting on his knees, giving her his full attention. "I was afraid," she continued, "that I would never see a face look at me without wanting something. That no one would see me as human." His breath caught. Because he had seen her that way the moment she raised her chin on that platform, proud, unbroken, alive. She glanced at him then, eyes shining not with tears, but with emotion too deep to name. "And then you stepped forward," she whispered, "and I didn't understand why." He felt heat rise in his chest, not embarrassment, but something tender and aching. "I didn't understand it either," he admitted. "Still don't, not fully." Thunder rumbled outside. The fire popped. Their shadows leaned closer without either of them moving. He reached out, slowly, giving her every chance to pull back, and rested his hand palm up on the floor between them. Not touching her. Just offering. She hesitated only a heartbeat before placing her hand lightly in his, fingers trembling as they intertwined. The contact was gentle, warm, full of something sacred. "I feared all men after I was taken," she said, voice barely above breath. "But you changed what fear feels like." He exhaled shakily, tightening his fingers around hers with careful strength. "And I haven't slept properly since the day I saw you," he confessed. "Not because I'm worried, but because I keep replaying that moment. Wondering if I did enough." Her eyes softened. She shifted closer, their knees brushing, a quiet, grounding touch that made the air thicken with warmth and unspoken longing. "I don't want to be afraid anymore," she whispered. He lifted his other hand slowly, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. His knuckles grazed her cheek, and she leaned into the touch, just barely, but enough to make his heart stumble. As the storm raged outside, she rested her forehead lightly against his shoulder. Her breath warmed the fabric of his shirt. His fingers traced the back of her hand, slow and reassuring. No words needed. In the glow of the fire and the shelter of the storm, something fragile and honest settled between them, not ownership. Not obligation. But a bond built on truth, and the first real spark of love. Two people who weren't meant to meet. Finally choose each other. By the time the last fire of the night burned down to glowing embers, the whole town had already shifted. Men who once looked at Nara with suspicion now kept a respectful distance. Women who had whispered behind her back now nodded politely when she passed. Even the sheriff, who rarely admitted being wrong, had taken off his hat and told Luke, "Maybe you saw something in her the rest of us were too blind to see." But none of that mattered to Luke. What mattered was the woman sitting quietly on the edge of his porch steps, her long dark hair drifting in the evening wind, her eyes following the stars like they were old friends. Nara was no longer the silent, damaged captive they had dragged into town. She wasn't the frightened girl clutching that cracked wooden bowl. She wasn't the trembling figure everyone expected to be weak and helpless. She had become something else entirely. Steady. Aware. Strong in ways Luke didn't yet have words for. He stepped out onto the porch carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She looked up, her eyes questioning. "This is yours," Luke said softly. She opened the cloth. Inside was the bowl, the same wooden one she had held so tightly during the auction, but now it was different. Luke had spent hours sanding it, smoothing the cracks, mending it with thin lines of polished silver inlay. He had rebuilt it using the Japanese method he'd once seen in a book: fill the broken parts with something precious so the object became more beautiful for having been broken. Nara's breath caught. Her fingers traced the shining lines. Her voice, still soft, but filled with new certainty, finally broke the quiet. "You fixed me." Luke shook his head. "No. You were never broken. I only helped you see it." For the first time, she reached for him without hesitation. Her hand, small, warm, steady, wrapped around his. Luke felt something shift in his chest, something he had been fighting for days. Something dangerous, something beautiful. Nara scooted closer, her voice trembling but brave. "You saved me, when no one else would." Luke swallowed. "I didn't save you. I just listened." "But you heard me," she whispered. The night settled around them like a blanket, warm, calm, alive with crickets. The wind carried the scent of juniper and dust. The sky above them burned silver with starlight. And then, gently, Nara leaned her head against his shoulder. Luke didn't move for a long moment. Not because he was unsure, he wasn't, but because the moment felt sacred. A choice. A beginning. A promise he didn't want to disturb by rushing. Finally, he rested his cheek on the top of her head. Not a kiss. Not a claim. Just two souls who had finally found the quiet, safe place they were meant to be. For the first time since the auction, Nara whispered a word that came from trust, not fear. Home. And Luke understood, she didn't mean the house. She meant him.